And welcome back to Subculture on centralcoastradio.com. Well, I'm about to chat to somebody on the show right now that I know a lot of you out there are very big fans of. I'm a very big fan of this man myself. We have got Stephen Wilson on the phone to chat about his brand new album that I know a lot of you out there are already very, very aware of because we've been taking a listen to some of the tracks off this album and you guys have already fallen in love with it. So without any other further ado, let's welcome Stephen to the show to talk about the Harmony Codex. Welcome to the program, Stephen.
Thank you very much for having me. Glad to be here.
No worries. Now, Stephen, it's always an honour to chat to you because going back 25 years, you were one of the first musicians I ever interviewed when I became a music journalist. So it's always amazing to be able to catch up with you again and chat to you. So welcome to the program.
Brilliant. Thank you.
So, Stephen, tell us a little bit about this album. Our listeners have been getting a little bit of a teaser over the past few weeks with us playing a few tracks off it. So tell us a little bit about the Harmony Codex and what was going through your own life and mind when you sat down to first start working on this album.
So, well, I think the first thing to know about the Harmony Codex is it is the proverbial lockdown project. It was a project I started because I found myself unable to tour my last album. So my last album, The Future Bites, came out right about the time that the pandemic all kicked in. At least it was announced. And suddenly I found all my plans, like everyone in the world, I found all my plans were cancelled. And I went back to the studio and I started creating this record. And what's interesting is I was creating this record kind of in a vacuum. I had no awareness. I mean, I was kind of in forced isolation. I had no awareness of anything else or anyone else really. So I was making this album pretty much for myself. I mean, there's an extent to which I do all of my projects for myself, but I think even more so with this one. And I think if I had any agenda with the record, it was to try to make an album experience which would be analogous with watching a movie. And trying to create something which almost would exist outside of any notion of genre. So the album is 65 minutes. It's constantly surprising. It's constantly moving. It's through different musical styles, changing direction, surprising you. Just, in just the same way that if you're watching a movie,
Yep.
The experiences of the characters change from scene to scene. 1 minute they're happy, then something tragic happens, then they're angry, So there's a constant sense of surprise when you're watching a movie, but that doesn't often happen in the context of an album. So I think that's what I wanted to try and do, something analogous with watching a movie, and that's what the Harmony Codex is.
Is that an idea that you'll go on with as well? I remember John Fox from Ultravox years and years ago did a similar thing where he did an album where he wanted it to kind of mirror a movie, and then within about 6 or 12 months he'd actually put together an experimental film and was running it with his music over the top of it. Is that something that you would do with this album down the track?
I mean, there's a sense that I'm definitely a frustrated, filmmaker. I mean, I grew up, and, like a lot of kids, I guess I grew up fascinated by music, but also fascinated by cinema and fascinated by, literature. And I was always looking for those, more profound experiences from music, from film, from literature. And to me, a lot of it kind of always fused in my head partly because of my dad. I grew up with a great love of conceptual rock music. So albums like Dark Side of the Moon, Tubular Bells, these are the kind of things that I remember him playing when I was a kid. These album-length experiences, which kind of felt like they were telling you a story. Even if it was just through the music, even if there was no lyrics, as in the case of Tubular Bells, it felt like the music was somehow visual. It was creating images for you. And I fell in love with that notion. To me, it was kind of embedded in my musical DNA right from the beginning, that there is this notion of music as kind of the equivalent of, cinema. So Now, of course, all of this with the caveat that we live in an era now where most musicians are expected to try and sell themselves in the space of 15 seconds in a TikTok video.
Yeah.
So what I'm doing is it's so out of, the zeitgeist, as it were, that it's almost to the point of absurdity. But a part of me also thinks that you should never underestimate the listener, and that there are people out there that still want, and hopefully your listeners would fall into that category. I'm sure they do. There are people out there that are still looking for a more profound experience from music.
Definitely. Stephen, it's interesting that you put this album together while you're in the lockdowns, because I found talking to artists, and I found myself as well, like being in Melbourne, we were in some of the strictest lockdowns worldwide, and I found my creative juices really flowed during that time. I was writing screenplays, I was writing a novel during that time, but I've spoken to other artists who just said that because they couldn't get out and about and go out and experience things, their creativity just dried up. How did you find that? Did you find that your creativity was flowing during that time?
It's interesting. I think it was a bit of both for me. For about the first 6 to 9 months, I loved it. I had so many things on the go. So I wrote my book. I created most of the music for the Harmony Codex. I started a podcast. I was having fun doing all these things, which I'd kind of said I was going to do for years and never got around to, Yeah. So writing the book was something I'd had on my list of things I was going to do one day. Never had the time to do it. And part of the book was also writing some fiction. There is some fiction in my book as well. One of the most important things I did during lockdown was to create the story, the Harmony Codex, which is a piece of dystopian sci-fi, which is in the book, and which obviously became the basis for the material on the album. So for about 9 months, I was having the greatest time. And then about 9 months in, I just hit a wall. And I think I've heard this from a lot of people, that I think they got to a point where they enjoyed the isolation for a certain period of time, but then it began to sort of creep up their spine like this kind of, malaise that was kind of sucking the life out of them. And I think I did hit that wall about 9 to 12 months in.
Yeah.
So I have to say I'm really pleased it's over now. Well, touch wood.
Yeah.
Touch wood is over. But yeah, for the first year, I think I got so much done.
Yeah.
And then I spent about a year staring at the wall, not waiting for it to be over,
You also mentioned before about the genre bending on this album, and I find when I was listening to it, it's one of the things I loved about it. But I'd love to know your frame of mind when you're working on the album, because like you have something acoustic like What Life Brings, and then you go into something gothic like Actual Brutal Facts. Did it kind of depend on the mood that you were in that day to how the song came out? Or I'd love to know how did it spark such genre blending on this album?
I wish I had an answer for you, but I don't. I mean, it's well, I kind of do. As you'd expect, I've always got something to say about everything. I don't have a simple answer for you, except to say that I think ever since I was a kid discovering music for the first time, I've never really acknowledged the notion of genre.
Yeah.
And that again it goes back to my parents. My dad listening to conceptual rock, my mum listening to Saturday Night Fever and Donna Summer and Frank Sinatra records and Dinah Washington records, and me being this young kid soaking it all up like a sponge, just thinking it was all magical. And then going to school and going to secondary school, and there was all the new wave of British heavy metal going on in one corner of the classroom, and then in the other corner of the classroom there were all the kids that were listening to reggae and two-tone, and then in another corner of the classroom there was all the kids that were listening to Gary Newman and Ultravox and the new waves, and I just thought it was all magical. I thought it was all amazing, and I couldn't understand why there was no sort of crossover between these people. So I just grew up loving it all, and I'm still like that.
Yeah.
So I think the simple answer to your question is I've never really recognized it. So I still listen across all genres. I'll listen to the Bee Gees 1 minute and then free jazz the next. Japanese extreme noise music 1 minute and then ABBA the next. And I don't recognize any notion of what's cool or what isn't cool. I don't care. I don't recognize any notion of, what sort of genre I might be sort of confusing in my mind. And I realized a long time ago that that's not necessarily common. I'm not saying it makes me any better than anyone else. It's just different. And I've always been like that. So I think when I go into the studio, I can just as easily find myself, channeling Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young 1 minute and then Nine Inch Nails the next. Yeah. And to me, there's no leap of logic involved in that, if you see what I'm saying.
Yeah, I agree completely. I'm the same. I grew up with a father who was a music lover, and the one thing he always distilled in me as a kid was there is good music in every genre, you've just got to find it. So as a result, people look at my album collection and they go, how can you have Cannibal Corpse, Cher, and Cold Chisel all in your collection there together? And it's just like, that's just what I'm like. Like, my Spotify lists are all over the place, but it annoys my wife no end.
Yeah, totally. I think that's exactly my philosophy.
Yeah.
That people say, what kind of music? People say to me, what kind of music do you like? I say, I like good music.
Yep.
Actually, sometimes I say I like music that has a strong personality to it. Because let's face it, a lot of music is very generic and feels like it's come out of a production line of somebody. It sounds like it's the result of someone's record collection and they've only got 3 records. Yeah. I find so much music sounds like that person's got 3 records and they basically combine them, and that's what. And that music has no interest to me. I love music that surprises me, that has personality, and it can be in any genre. It can be in reggae, it can be in hip-hop, it can be in death metal, it can be in country and western, it can be in pure cheesy pop. I don't care. If it's got something, if it's got some personality and grain to it. And I think, so again, I think this all comes to bear on my music and having the confidence in a way to know that I can draw on anything and it just sounds like me at the end of the day. It doesn't really matter what I channel. It kind of just comes out the other end of the sausage machine, sounding like Stephen Wilson. That's not a very nice analogy, particularly coming from a vegan, but you know what I'm saying anyway. It just comes out the other end sounding like Stephen Wilson anyway. So I'm kind of, but maybe it's taken me 30 years to get that confidence to realise that about myself anyway.
Yeah. Stephen, the other thing that really hits me with this album is the amazing guests that you work with, the collaborators on this album. Tell us a little bit about some of the collaborators that you work with this time around and how you chose who you wanted to work with.
Well, again, because a lot of it was done during lockdown, I found myself having to do a lot more of sort of the dreaded file sharing, sort of, collaboration. For the first time, unable to go into a studio with a consistent group of musicians, but I kind of turned that into a positive. So rather than sort of, bemoaning the fact that I couldn't have a consistent group of musicians across the record, I kind of approached each track almost like, okay, what kind of musical language do I want to speak with here? What kind of musical vocabulary? What kind of musical world do I want this track to inhabit, So you mentioned earlier, say, for example, a track like Actual Brutal Facts, which is a much more, harder, more industrial, almost kind of industrial hip-hop or gothic edge to it. And that for that track, I reached out to Jack Danes from Meat Beat Manifesto, which is a very, very well-established, well-respected industrial hip-hop, artist emerged from the late 80s, who I've been a fan of for years, So I kind of reached out to him, and then other tracks, it was all a case of like, well, what kind of drummer do I want on this track? Impossible Tightrope, for example, I was like, you know what, I want a jazz drummer, but I want a jazz drummer that's grown up listening to Square Pusher and Aphex Twin. and then I began to ask around. So I'd start asking around, this is kind of what I've got in mind. And gradually I would get put in the direction of this amazing American drummer called Nate Wood, who ended up being exactly that. He's got this jazz sensibility, but he's also grown up listening to drum and bass. So, I think that was part of the joy on this record, being able to almost have a kind of idea in my head about the kind of musical world I wanted a track to inhabit. And then just asking around or reaching out to people I already knew, maybe from my past, maybe some of the artists I'd remixed, because I've done a lot of remix work over the last few years. So Roland from Tears for Fears, for example, got involved on one track because I'd remixed a lot of Tears for Fears catalogue. So, I'm very fortunate to have a lot of contacts, and very fortunate, I suppose, also to have a lot of respect. Even though I'm not the biggest selling artist, I'm certainly far from a household name. I think a lot of other musicians know that if they get an invitation from me, at least it's going to be something interesting, for them to get their teeth into.
Definitely. Stephen, I know we're running out of time very, very quickly. So to finish off, you are a household name in the households of a lot of our listeners. So to finish off, what would you like to say to our listeners out there before they sit down and take a listen to the Harmony Codex?
Okay. Turn the lights off and make 65 minutes of uninterrupted time available, please. I know that sounds really pompous and really arrogant, but I think that's the way you'll get the most out of this record. I really think of it as sitting down to watch a movie. You wouldn't stop a movie well, you might, but generally speaking, people don't stop movies in the middle, and they don't check their email or text message in the middle of a movie. Well, at least when they go to the cinema, they don't anyway. And that's kind of how I want people to experience this. So if possible, try and experience it that way.